Welcome to Casual Conversation. I'm Lulu Sofiana, the host of Casual Conversation. Please feel free to ask question or to interrupt us anytime you want to ask question or you want to clarify something. Please do not wait until the end of the session. Before we start, I want to ask the participants, please type in your chat box, like what do you know about Canada? Type on
It
your
would be really interesting.
What do you know about Canada? Or maybe you know something a little bit, or you have no idea about Canada because it's very far. When you hear the word Canada, what comes up in your mind? Just type it. Anything that comes up in your mind about Canada. The diversity, multiculturalism, and the openness about it. Interesting. Because if we talk about diversity in Indonesia, we also have people from many different, if here it's ethnicities. So yeah, we have thousand islands
Yes.
with hundreds languages. So it's also, so some of the participants asking me before this session, Salma, like why Canada? I mean, multiculturalism, like mostly Indonesia are more common with that with that
Yes.
label than Canada. Why Canada? Is it that Canada has only one major population? Like, is there many culture or ethnicities over there?
Oh, sorry. I was just looking at all the texts of your students here. So cool. Penguin. 2 bears so far.
Penguin? Is there penguin there?
That would be in Antarctica. I don't know. I've never been to Nunavut, which is one of the very, very cold provinces. Maybe, I don't know. I'm not really familiar with wildlife in Canada, unfortunately. But there are bears that I can tell you in my region. We can at least around, like I've been to forests and reindeers and bears and certain wildlife we're aware of in the forests. Penguins, never seen one. Sorry, Maddie. So your question on why Canada, that is a good question. I think Canada tends to be known stereotypically as the country of multiculturalism and diversity, and now it is becoming a source of identity even for those who are here. Like we're known with multiculturalism and diversity of different cultures. I don't think, however, that we have as many ethnicities. I could be wrong. I need to double check that. But to my knowledge, Indonesia has about 630 ethnicities, which is tremendous. I don't know if we are on that bar. And the reason I say that, because the history of Canada, how multiculturalism was introduced to Canada was, we have to understand that it is a country that has a colonial history. So the original settlers in Canada, we usually describe them as Indigenous people. And then you had the British and French colonials come into Canada. And that, due to wars, has really decreased the diversity of ethnicities in the Indigenous population in Canada. Now, to solve the colonial problem in Canada between the British and the French, they thought it would be good to open the borders to more people so that we then define Canada as not a colonial land, but a multicultural land where a lot of people from around the world come and settle, supposedly in peace with Indigenous people. So it doesn't really solve the Indigenous problem. But then by opening the borders to other minorities, so Indians from India or Chinese people from China. Mainly these were the very first 2 minority colored demographic that came, with some African population from the US escaping from the US slavery. And then eventually it opened up to other, then we see Muslim populations from mainly Arab, Middle Eastern countries and South Asian countries from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. And therefore, when you come to some places in Canada, you will see in Toronto, for example, something like Chinatown. I don't know if you had it in Washington or in Boston, but like this is a huge neighborhood. Now it's a district. It has a huge history in Toronto, where eventually the very first generation Chinese immigrants were treated badly, and they were segregated and lived alone in a different neighborhood than the rest of the population of Caucasian European origin. And then now it's a touristic area. So over the time that changed. So Canada, the reason, part of why it opened up to other countries and having other people is to kind of reconcile with its colonial past. That is definitely one of the reasons. Another reason is because it's good for the economy. So if you have certain people of other experiences and other educations can come and work and bring with money and investment. So now multiculturalism have become this idea that now a lot of countries are looking for as a way of solving their economic problems, especially if you're going to come with a lot of money from your homeland and invest in that country. I'm saying this as if it's easy and as if it's nice, but it has other problems that maybe you can ask about and I go into details with. But now, because the world has become very global and connected and we get information easily and people travel easily, so it fits with Canada's history to be defined as multicultural, especially now when we used to have a really tense relationship with the US. So we were seen as the good brother of the US, like we're welcoming and everything, while in the US they had tough history, tough periods of times. So it's, to me, the way I see it, it's marketing in a way that becomes part of the national identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also explained to the audience, they asked me question before that although maybe in Indonesia we have many ethnicities, but in Canada we have people from is it like from many countries?
Yes, nationalities.
Although there are no ethnicities, many as ethnicities similar to Indonesia, but they have people from many nationalities that now settled there and like create the multicultural environment in Canada.
Yeah. I think what would be interesting, and I wish to see in our Canadian statistics, I can't really find it, but mainly because we didn't really collect information by race. Now we are, but before we didn't. I think there are many ethnicities in Canada if we are considering people who come from different. So, for example, when I was doing my research on Malays, Malay Canadians, Malay is an ethnicity. It's a racial ethnicity. It's so detailed that if I'm going to Canadian statistics, I won't find statistics on Malay people. I'll find Malaysian or Indonesian or Singaporean, so by nationality. But if you were to talk to the people, they will tell you, oh, I come from that ethnicity, or I come from that tribe. So it's, I don't think on a governmental level, we were able to capture the diversity of ethnicities, but I think it exists. And the difference it would have with Indonesia, for example, is that now you have ethnicities that are coming from all around the world. While in Indonesia, it's local. In Canada, it's very international. So that makes it a bit unique, I think.
Salma, I also want to point out on your statement before that the Canada is like a little brother or big brother of the US.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms of like the education system, similar to the US, or for instance, when the student like confused on deciding whether I should choose a United States university or Canadian university, which one better? I mean, in terms of like educational system, or which one easier?
Canadian or American in terms of universities?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a very good question. I can't really say so in terms of prestige per wise, like in terms of like the international acknowledgement, and I think to be fair, depending on which department, but generally I think the US does a much greater job in terms of research. Doesn't matter which research. There are specific universities that you can look into, depending on your department, that excel in research opportunities and courses, and a diversity of courses that can really open up your mind in terms of what you want to learn. Canada's education is also on par. It's not weak, I would say, but I think in the US, like for me now, considering that I want to go for my PhD, most of my professors would say, go to the US, get your PhD in the US. So so there's no denial that there are universities in the US that have much better opportunities in terms of research capacity and professor supervision and experience. Mm-hmm. Canada's academic system on a higher educational level, even an undergrad, but I would say from my experience in higher education, is not easy. So in comparison to the UK, for example, if you're going for a PhD for 3 years in the UK, in Canada, it takes up 4 to 5 years. And you can extend if you have enough scholarship or grants, yes. And the reason is because we have 2 years where we have to study for a comm exam. It's not in the UK. In the US, I think they were able to reconcile it in some universities where they just merge your MA with your PhD. So, which would be a total of 5 years. And to me, that's awesome. If you can get into such a program, you just like killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Others, yeah. So I think for Canada, we have a reputation, not only in education, but career-wise, that if you come with, and let's say you have an incredible long history in your career working in IT, and you come to Canada wanting to work in IT, they might have you spend a few years doing an equivalent certificate in IT to show them that you have IT experience in Canada. Or in medicine, it's even harder. They take more years studying all over again, and then so that they can work in medicine in Canada. So I think in Canada, we're known, that's known about us, even if you come from Australia and you have your education in Australia, they don't care. Here, you have to have the Canadian experience. So sometimes we make it a bit harder on people. So personally, going back to your question, I think the US academically in some universities would have known supervisors that would be good for you, better research facilities, and they're known internationally that they're better in research. So it doesn't matter where you go, if you have that degree from the US, it's always better.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean if, yeah. Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah. That doesn't mean if you graduate from Canada, it's not worth it when you go back to Indonesia or Malaysia. It's still important. It's still valuable, much more valuable. But if we were to say to compare between Canada and the US, I would say the US.
Yeah. It's undeniable so far.
Yeah.
So, Salma, we have a comment from Lydia that he thinks that multicultural society with different identity can bring us some new energy, but in other side, they might become source of conflict. Is there conflict between nationalities in Canada?
Yeah, Lydia, can you clarify what you mean by the other side? Which other side? Like in the East?
No. I mean, he means that in one side, multiculturalism can bring energy, but in other side, it also can create conflict.
Yes. Oh, I see what you mean. Definitely. I mean, I actually think that there's no society and no country that is monolithic, which means that they're all the same with no diversity. The thing is, some cultures, if they come from different, like in Canada, where technically all of us are immigrants, that does have some problems, but I think on the positive side, it makes a lot of people more conscious and aware of the differences and therefore more sensitive. But that's the nicer version of it, and I would say for the most part, people are trying to be sensitive with each other. However, there is discrimination, very visible discrimination sometimes, especially in the system, systematically. And I think we see that more in the US, because Canada appears as a nicer version of it, but it's also visible here. And mainly this has to do with that you have, going back to that colonial history, you have a specific ethnic race that have, been in the system, in the politics for a very long time, and is familiar with media and familiar with those big pillars that hold the society, and therefore they control a lot of that power. Now, what we're seeing now, which is changing in Canada, that our generation, my generation, and younger generations are really trying to get into politics, are really trying to get so that minority visibility would be represented when we say that Canada is multicultural. That came with a lot of years of confrontation and a lot of years of really documenting discrimination and racial incidents. By calling the police and saying, "Oh, I just experienced this person is, is threatening me," by saying that unfortunately, maybe using the N-word, like I'm a Negro, and maybe saying all these bad slurs and whatnot. And in some cases, it could be even worse, like threatening to kill me. So you call the police and that gets documented, and therefore in social policy, we say, okay, we have seen a rise of discrimination against these certain people. This is recent. This is not, I wouldn't say like Canadian history is familiar with this, no. This came upon a push from minorities to try and find themselves in the system as well, to say, no, we exist here and we can also contribute to the system. So definitely in multiculturalism, although on a smaller scale with your neighbors, and in school, people would be conscious and trying to, live in peace, because usually people don't want trouble. They try to learn from each other and put the differences of multiculturalism aside. Sometimes we do see these incidents, and they do reflect on a smaller scale on, discrimination or calling people with slurs or certain names sometimes. So, and I think this happens in all countries and in all, when I was doing my MA for my research, it was interesting to me to see that some of my participants were saying, if I was back in India, people would call the indigenous people red Indian and nobody would say anything. That's normal. Or, the whole idea of having whitening creams so that you would appear your skin whiter, so that you're more beautiful. This we see. These are manifestations of not accepting the diversity of people in society. So I think this is happening everywhere. It's an effort that needs. It's a problem that needs addressing, and an effort from the people and the system in every country. But in Canada, it's becoming more highlighted because Canada markets itself as very multicultural.
Yeah.
So it has to live on a very high bar of saying, okay, we got to work on how we're gonna, really accept this diversity. But other countries don't really say that, oh, I'm multicultural. Like Indonesia, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't hear Indonesia, for example, coming and saying, I'm a multicultural country. They would say, I'm Indonesian, and maybe belong to that ethnicity. But multicultural, I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. It makes me wonder, like, what do you know? Like, how far you know about Indonesia?
Yeah, I know about Pencak Silat in Indonesia. Yeah, yeah. I practiced it. I used to practice it with the Malay community here in my province. Yeah, and we performed in 2017 in an Asim festival. So I know there's a variety of Pencak Silat as well. So I'm not really sure what was our type, but it was I was really fascinated by it in the sense that it reflects the movements reflect a lot of animal movements and a lot of observations from the environment, and there's also a mix of religion in it and how you pray. And do your wudu, your ablution, the Muslim ablution. So for me, that was something that was very unique, and the fact that it originates from Indonesia was really fascinating, because I think not a lot of majority Muslim countries would define themselves, or majority Muslim identities would define or would reflect their identity in martial arts.
Yeah.
So for me, that was that's something you guys should be really proud of. I don't think there's.
But unfortunately, like the martial art from Japan, it's famous here or even in other countries, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Own martial art.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even at school, in my children's school, they learn like taekwondo, not like the pencak silat.
I think this needs some national backup to kind of like make it appealing to the people to go back to. As someone from anthropology, it's interesting because it's, as you said, I noticed that we have something called soft culture or soft power, and strong power. And soft power is like when culture really influences people. So Taekwondo would be interesting because there's the Korean wave, for example, K-pop and K-dramas and all that. So people now are more interested in Korean culture. So that came upon investment from the government to make, okay, that's the power that I want to fund into media and all of that. I would love to see that with Pencak Silat because it goes back to the history of royalty of the Sultanate and the Sultanates in Indonesia back then and all that, and how it was used, and people believe it's used to protect their territories and all of that. And to connect with nature and the environment and energies. I can see why it's not as as attractive to this current generation, because I think it has more connection with rural areas and agriculture, while we have modernized to cities, and it makes sense Taekwondo to learn it to self-defense, but Pencak Silat is not only self-defense. So I can see why other kinds of martial arts are more appealing. But also I think it has to do with, Southeast Asia in general hasn't been seen as that, as that representative power in comparison to its East Asian neighbors like China or Japan or Korea. So what comes from there has more influence on Indonesia, I can see, but not the other way around. But not in all aspects, actually. But we can get to that sometime else. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, people are trying to bring the good thing about Indonesia to be more popular for our young generation. Actually, there is one movie that like telling about the history, if I'm not mistaken, about Pencak Silat. If you're really interested in that, you can watch the movie. I think the title is Merantau. Am I right? Maybe the audience can clarify me. The title is Merantau. Basically, it means migrate or move to another city. So
Merantau.
yeah, but it's like portray the how people like teaching like continue Pencak Silat from one generation to the next generation. Well, interesting.
Can you spell it for me?
M E
Yeah.
R
R
A
A,
N
N or M?
N
N. Yeah.
U N N T
Yeah.
T
T
A
E A
U.
U. Right. Oh. Oh, nice. Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
that's it. Is it wait, hold on. Oh,
Yeah, I
when
think
was it?
after
That was in 2009.
after play that movie, the actor was invited to play in some of Hollywood movie because of
Wow.
successfully uh, like acting in that movie. So that
I
yeah,
will watch it. I'm really I love martial arts. So for me, when like Jackie Chan and martial arts movies are like yes. So I'll definitely watch that one.
what is
Um,
the actor name? Is it Iko Uwais? Am I right, audience? Please clarify me if I'm wrong. I think it's Iko Uwais.
yeah, equal wise.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Oh my God, we
Yes.
never really talk about pencak silat. What other thing that you know or make you inspire about Indonesian?
So, other than it has an amazing weather in comparison to here, it's tropical, and I think, but the movie and the book Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth, I think Elizabeth Gilbert is her name. I forgot her name. Um, was featured in Bali, and I think it appropriated a little bit of what Indonesia is like. But for me, when I watched like the scenery of Indonesia in that movie Bali, that was like, oh my god, I want to be there.
You want to be
So
there, and I want to be there.
for me, it was like amazing nature. I think you guys have an incredible, or you're really blessed with the nature that you have on your land in terms of the diversity of species in your oceans and the plants. And these are all definitely, I mean, Canada has incredible wildlife. I take it for granted and I don't really look at it. So when you live in a place, you don't really realize. But like as an outsider, to me, nature in Indonesia is incredible. It's
Yeah.
there's another thing that also it's a bit historical. So the Sultanate of Aceh,
Mm-hmm.
right? Do you say Aceh? Yeah. I think the last there was Katniak Dien. She was one of the last.
Oh, Cut Nyak Dien.
Yes, Jutniak Dien. Sorry. Yeah. I was really fascinated by her to know that she led a whole army against the Dutch colonial forces. Um, to me, I think I was interested in that because at the time in high school when I was reading about it, which is like 10 years ago, I seem old now, but back really long time ago, when I was reading about her, she came at a time when in Canada, Muslim women were seen as, very submissive, not able to protect themselves or oppressed by their men. So doing a research, she came out and I was like, wow, who would have known? So I know Aceh now in anthropology actually is a fascination to some anthropologists because of how it came to be now, and there's a huge controversy over its politics. But to me, that figure was really interesting to see in Indonesian history. So yeah,
Maybe Cut Nyak Dien is like our Mulan version. It's just not as
yes, that's a good comparison.
we have to make
Yeah,
a Hollywood movie about Cut Nyak Dien instead.
it has to be. I think though it's interesting that Indonesian the way Indonesia is represented in Hollywood would be, maybe to your audience, would be something somebody might be interested to look into for the research. Polynesian or women of islands in Hollywood movies are represented in a certain way that's always sexualized, or like is not very representative of the current Indonesia. So it would be interesting to see, you know, how in movies, especially, they're not represented as much now. But I would say in the 1990s, 1980s, there were movies like these that were interesting. I don't remember what, you know what, I'm going to look. There is one that I know is supposed to be a relationship between a British officer and an Indonesian tribal woman. And I think the one who was acting the Indonesian woman was Lopez or some, wait, hold on.
Really?
Yes, yeah, it was. It's on my to watch list.
What is it movie? What is the title of
It's a movie. It's a movie. I'm looking it up right now because I forgot the name of it. But it was an issue, the way they were representing the whole idea of what Indonesia is, and the image of the woman and the relationship and all of that.
Why not? They
Not her. There was someone.
Indonesia.
Yeah, they did not hire someone who's Indonesian, no. Which always happens in Hollywood movies, right? That, you know, the whole casting of other people to represent other people. I can't find it, but keep asking me questions and I'm looking it up right now. I'm trying to find it. If somebody from the audience can like Google something like that, please help me out here.
Audience, if you want to ask question, please feel free. You can type on the chat box or you can turn on your microphone directly. And Salma, as a lay people, my lay people understanding about Canada has many space. In my perspective, like Canada has many empty space, while in Indonesia we have too many people, and now the space are limited. Like the housing become smaller and smaller, and not like a long time ago that our parents, for instance, have a very large house with a very large yard, and nowadays people have a very small house. And yeah, because of the limited area or the limited land in Indonesia compared to the number of people. Do you think like I have a correct understanding that Canada still have many places to live, or is it livable, or maybe actually that places it's not livable?
Is it, if I may ask, when you say that houses are becoming smaller, is it in the urban cities or also affecting the rural areas?
Yeah, it's affecting the rural area as well.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay. I've never really thought of this, but I would say that in Canada we do have spaces in terms of environmental conservation. Mm-hmm. So in order to protect the environment, because we are we have to abide by international environmental laws by the UN, and wildlife protection. We can't. There's a limitation that we can't keep, taking from the forests and the farming lands. However, there are cities that they have expanded. So not too far away from me, there's a city called Milton. And when I lived in Milton about 13 years ago or something like that, or maybe less. By the time I left, they were already expanding into the farming lands, trying to build a university. So it's happening in some cities, but I think the reason maybe that it appears that we have space is because we're also confined by certain spaces and certain treaties with the indigenous people. So the indigenous people here, some of them do live on reserves that is just for them, and we can't trespass on them. And these reserves also have to protect their way of life, which includes sometimes fishing and hunting. And therefore, we can't trespass on some forests and some other lands. And this has been a cause of tension in Canada because of oil, because the reserves have oil, and sometimes the government wants to dig that oil under their ground, and they refuse to dig those for obvious reasons. So so that's why it might seem that we have more green lands and more trees, and because we're really trying to create some balance. I did feel that way when I was living in Turkey, because in Turkey it seemed like the houses are squashed beside each other. There was no space, no greenery. The city is so metropolitan. It's it's a weird mix of history of really old buildings and really new buildings, and no space for the environment. So when I came back, I was like, okay, yeah, no, we seem to be doing it somehow better. So I can see why it might. I think that's the explanation I have, but there could be other reasons that I'm unaware of. But I know from my studies that we are tied by certain environmental treaties, and because of our unique history with indigenous people, this is something that we can't easily violate, or else it could lead to big conflicts.
Maybe because of the Turkish people as well as the Indonesian people are the indigenous people, so it means like it's like their own home, so that in their own house, so that they can do anything. Like it's whether if you are how to say, if you are migrate to one places, meaning that you have to adhere to the rule on that place, and you should consider how the local will react if you do something which is for the local. If they want to do anything, it's up to them. Like they might not really consider how other people think about in terms of managing
I
the
see what you
city
mean.
or etc.
I think in terms of urban planning and environmental protection, I do hold institutions accountable more than the people. The people maybe sometimes are forced to live that way because there's no other way that was provided to them as an alternative. Or maybe maybe there are alternatives, but they could be more expensive. And people cannot afford it. So I do hold institutions accountable in providing better lifestyles for the people. I would hold the people accountable for not pressing the institutions to try to change the reality. Sometimes you get so used to the way of life, even if it's not healthy for you, and don't question the institutions on why are we, statistics show that population is that pollution is increasing, that there's water contamination, that people don't have privacy, that yada, yada, yada. And if the people are not holding the institutions accountable, then the institutions just, sometimes just don't change anything. So it is I would say, a responsibility on both sides, but more so on getting the institutions to do the work. That's why they're there in the first place. You get an urban planning degree to work in a sector in the government to make changes in the city. However, I would say also the modernization process in cities particularly has become the norm everywhere, that cities are noisy, crowded, overpopulated, polluted. I don't think it's now. I think is a great time for psychologists and anthropologists and to really look at, and environmentalists to really look at it, the effects this has on the human health. Seeing more depression in cities and more mental health issues in the cities than, for example, those who live in rural areas. We're seeing more diseases in the cities than in rural areas. So this tells us something, that the urban planning of the cities needs changing the way it's conducted.
Yeah.
But this is not an Indonesian problem. It's a worldwide problem. All countries wanted to modernize in a certain way, and they all took the same kind of copied each other in the way a city looks like. some mismanaged it more than others, but we're seeing similar symptoms everywhere.
Yeah. Talking about the human health, we have a question from Tommy. Is in Canada pharmacists does exist? Because in Indonesia there's a lot people just know about doctor, not pharmacists.
Are there pharmacists in Canada?
Yeah,
Is that the Yes, yes, we have pharmacies are essential. So yes, there are many pharmacies in Canada, but I don't think there are a lot of pharmaceutical schools in Canada. Interestingly, I never I don't know even what the process of going into pharmacy in Canada looks like. It's usually he's right. The common thing that people know about Canada is medicine and medical schools, and they're very competitive and known and prestigious. So, but not pharmacy. So that's a good question. But there are pharmacists in Canada. That degree is there and that job is there, but not as many schools as there are for medicine.
I think what Tommy means, Salma, like how Canadian usually what the pharmacists do in Canada, and also how the people usually go to the pharmacies. Like in here, if we are sick, we just know that we have to go to the doctor, not like to the pharmacist. So is it the same, or are Canadian also refer to a pharmacist when they sick, or just go to the doctor?
So you have to go to the doctor first. Okay, so I don't know about Indonesia, how pharmacies would have the same process or not, but for us in pharmacies, you have something called on the shelf. So there are medicines that you don't need a prescription for, and you just go and just get it from the shelf. So if you go to Walmart, they do have a section where it's on the shelf. So you can go get a Gravel for your stomach, or Panadol or Advil if you have like a painkiller. You don't need a prescription for that. You don't need even to go to a doctor for that. However, if you need a specific kind of medication that is not on the shelf and it's dangerous to be provided just for anybody, then you need to see a doctor first. And then the doctor would give you a prescription, and you go to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist would either sell it to you if it's not covered by the healthcare system, and if it is covered by the healthcare system, so you don't need to buy anything. So they just give it to you with a specific amount of pills that the doctor prescribes. So it's just not endless. And that's why you have to see the doctor first, because the doctor will say, okay, you need to take this medication for 3 months, for example, not forever. And then if you need it more, they renew the medication. So that's how it works. But you can't go to the pharmacist first. You can go to the pharmacist if it's something general, or to inquire about some medications, if they have it or not. But the pharmacist cannot give you a medication without the prescription of a doctor first.
Okay, yeah, I think it's similar to here. Pretty much.
Yeah, I don't think. I know in some countries though. I understand. I can see why that question might have been asked. Is some countries there's no control over the pharmaceutical industry. So it's a business, and if you pay for the medication, you just take it. So, yeah, no, you can't do that here.
Yeah. So, Salma, I think our audience start to interest in the vulnerable people. So,
yes.
Yeah. Could you tell us your experience in interviewing or dealing with the refugees, for instance, or other vulnerable people in Canada or in Turkey or in other places that you met?
Yes. So initially my initial job was not a social anthropologist. I started my bachelor's in political science, and I was more interested in dealing with international politics. So I worked while I was studying in my undergrad in around my third and fourth year. I worked in the city hall of the city I was studying in, which was Hamilton. Mm-hmm. So I interned there, and my job was to be a research assistant to formulate a policy so that we can start an indigenous committee for indigenous people who live in Hamilton. Mm-hmm. That was my first experience because some indigenous people would be under the categorization of vulnerable people. And for those who didn't join us early on, Lulu and I, we were talking about what is vulnerable. So that would be different from one country to the other, and that would be different according to the circumstances and time. However, there are general categorizations of what a vulnerable person is. So someone who has a disability, or someone who is more likely to be abused or discriminated against. So if they're refugees or newcomers, and especially if they're low income, who are receiving welfare or governmental support. Some indigenous people do fit in that category in Canada, or at least in Hamilton. So we needed to create a committee for them to represent them. My other experience was, after that, I worked in social work in an NGO where we were having a lot of Syrian refugees coming into Canada during the Syrian crisis. And that required, so my job was to try and find them jobs. So, and also provide them with training in English. So we were working on an English program for them. And this was a governmental organization, so it was supported by the government. It was not a private one. And we have a baby with us. Hi. Hello.
Hi, Salma.
Who's that little guy?
Hi. So I'm Imas. I am Lulu's best friend here.
Oh, hello.
Okay.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Sorry I didn't join you earlier because of the baby, of course.
That's okay. That's totally fine. He's always welcome. Baby, is it a she or a he?
She.
Oh yeah, she is. She. It's she.
It's a she. It's a she. So
Yeah.
she might be one of like our future social workers.
Thank you. I have a question, but it's going to be out of topic. Is it okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So there are two main languages in Canada, if I'm not mistaken. They are English and French. Is that so?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. Do the languages, because we believe that language also shapes people's characteristics. So I'm wondering about the people in Canada. Or do you find any distinguished characteristics between people who speak English and people who speak French?
Yes.
So, or they're just Canadian, or they have like some particular, definite characteristics over there.
That's a great
Thank you.
question. That's a really good question. Thank you. So definitely French speakers, they mainly live in Quebec province, and they are more influenced by France and the culture of France. So we can see that in terms of, and their accent is interesting. They have a specific French accent to them that's different than the French accent from France, or the main French accent from Paris, for example. But their Quebecois French accent, you can go on YouTube, and there are a lot of comparisons of the Quebecois French accent and the Paris French accent. You don't need to learn French if you do not live in Quebec. So those who live in the other English-speaking provinces mainly know English, but French is offered in high school and elementary school and middle school, so that you know the basics. If you want to take it further, you can. It does reflect the Quebecois do have a bit of a different system than the rest of the English-speaking provinces in Canada, even in their education. So they tend to have less tuition fees than us. They tend to have different services than us, and they're very, the stereotype is that they're very proud of their French identity. And this also is influenced by some French politics from France. So whenever France tends to ban the headscarf, for instance, sometimes Quebec would say, I want to ban the headscarf too. But the rest of Canada doesn't, the rest of the English-speaking provinces don't usually act the same way. So there is that difference for sure. In terms of English, there's also a difference because there are Canadian accents that a lot of people are not aware of. The British Columbians do sometimes have an accent where, for example, or even in Nova Scotia, because Nova Scotia is a fishing culture and they are usually by bigger lakes and oceans, so they're known for their fishing industry. And there's Prince Edward Island as well, where those who read Anne of Green Gables would know it's from there. So that's a whole other culture that they're known for. Then, for example, in British Columbia, where the weather is better, so the city is different. And Canada, in Ontario, where I live, we have a franchise called Tim Hortons. You are less likely to find it in British Columbia. There's more Starbucks there than Tim Hortons, which is the Canadian franchise for coffee. So definitely, yeah, the English is that does reflect on certain behaviors and habits, social habits, I would say. Oh, the word I was thinking of that, for example, we'd say about in Nova Scotia, and maybe sometimes in British Columbia, they would say a boot. So that's a difference in the accent right there. However, I think not all cities in Canada are very visibly multicultural. So Toronto is known to be a very visibly multicultural city. But Quebec or Montreal, in Quebec, the French-speaking province. But let's say, for example, I visited Nova Scotia, the province of Nova Scotia, and I've been to Halifax. Halifax is not very visibly multicultural. It's known to have more seniors, more Caucasian European-oriented people, especially from Scotland. There's a very visible Scottish heritage there. There are some minorities, obviously, and there's a big Indigenous population there, but they're not as visible as Toronto. And that does reflect on the culture and also the interaction between minorities and a visibly majority population. And again, I would say this is also, I think, in every country, all cities have a visible different cultural habits that would reflect their people. So I'm sure, I would love to know in Indonesia, how is that like? I'm sure you would be like, oh, if you're from that city, you're probably, you would say that word that way, or you're more known to wear that dress that way, or that hijab maybe that way. I don't know. So it's similar everywhere, I would say. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it answers. Yeah, it is a really satisfying
reply.
Thank you so much. That's a new insight for me. And also, I read a novel. But that novel is kind of heavily from the author's experiences. So he went to Canada. I guess that's Quebec, if I'm not mistaken, because it's a French-speaking city, and also it was famous with the seniors. The seniors were, I couldn't say, they were very kind and generous, and also it said in the novel, it said that they didn't need to lock the houses because the city is so safe, so they don't need to they don't even care about the key or the door, so they just let the doors open, and they don't need to worry about thieves or burglars or robberies and some things like that. So yeah, it's like, is it does that kind of city still exist or just in a novel?
I would love to know that city. I would say in Canada it's relatively safer. I personally haven't faced experiences where I forgot a bag somewhere and came back and it wasn't stolen. I just found it where it is. Or people would usually give it to the lost and found, or if there's a security, so you know where to get it, generally. But the bigger the city, I would say, like, for example, I live in a city called Mississauga, very close to Toronto. I wouldn't say that I would not lock my door. There have been incidents of gun shooting in other places surrounding us, so people don't feel as safe, I suppose. But when I was in Milton, I felt very safe. I was around farmlands, and it was a smaller city, and people knew each other, so I didn't feel as threatened. But in Mississauga, and I've also been in Hamilton, I've been in situations where there has been, for example, discrimination against me as a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf. So I was pushed before physically. So I think the bigger the city, and even in Canada, I wouldn't say it's 100% people don't lock the door in big cities. But in smaller cities, and if people know each other, I think there's a relative sense of safety. But generally in the streets during the day, I didn't feel too threatened or felt like when I lost something, I couldn't find it again. And I think also we have a culture here where we're not really scared of our police. So if something happens, we generally feel comfortable. Yeah, so which was interesting to me because when I was in Turkey and I got lost, I right away went to the police to ask them for help. So my Turkish friends and my non-Canadian friends, when they heard this, they said this is a very Canadian thing to do. Because some countries, they come from a background where the police relations are not very safe. And generally it's not safe to not lock your door and all of that. So I would say we're relatively okay. We're considered safer than other places.
Okay.
Would you like to go back to the question on vulnerability?
Yeah.
Yes. So in my experience with vulnerable people, I stopped at working as a social worker in an NGO where we were having a lot of Syrian refugees. My work was not only with Syrian refugees. I was saying that around my third, fourth year, I started also working in social work with an NGO where we had our flux of Syrian refugees. I was not only working with the Syrian refugees, we had already a large amount of new immigrants and refugees who were from Iraq, Afghanistan, immigrants from other parts of Africa. So we had a lot of work to do in finding these people, particularly jobs, because a lot of them come with no jobs. So in order to get them off the welfare system, you got to find them something to work and an income to the household. Other than that, some of them, their English wasn't very strong, so we needed to provide English training. And also we had training in terms of how to answer interviews, and we were creating events for them to try and make them become more integrated into the Canadian culture. So I would say in these two jobs early on in my undergrad, they shaped a lot of my interest to deal with people who come from backgrounds that we might not even imagine. So, for example, the Syrian crisis, a lot of these people escaped war. A lot of them had a lot of traumas. In many cases, especially the men, they were not comfortable talking about these traumas, and they would dismiss them by laughing and always, making jokes and trying to distract themselves and talking about other things, but not really focusing. You start knowing that there's something wrong when they're not really focusing on their training, on improving their English. Like there are a lot of problems that are occupying their mind that requires a lot of training, I think, for social workers to be able to point and to really have them talk about these issues. And it's not easy, especially if they come from a completely different culture than Canadian culture. We had an incident once where I was working, helping a settlement worker because I was an assistant. So she got a call in the morning from one of her clients who was originally from Iraq, and he was abused by his wife. So that's a really interesting case, because we think usually that it's the wife that's being abused, but in this case, it was the man who was being abused. And he ran away from home and he spent the night in his car, and he was just waiting in the morning for the settlement worker to get to the office so that she can come and pick him up, because he wants to divorce. He can't take the abuse anymore. Now, we might think that the abuse of this woman is, domestic violence, which it is, but this is a woman who escaped a war, and it could be that she's struggling with PSTD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. So you're really dealing with families that are really breaking apart sometimes, and it requires a lot of sensitivity, emotional intelligence, intuition to really read the atmosphere and to be very picky with your language when you're talking with them. Because you might say something that might trigger something in them. I'm not saying that all refugees come with a lot of package of emotional trauma, because some of them might not have experienced the war right away. They might have been able to escape earlier on. But movement in itself to another country, another culture, a place you don't know the people or the language, that's hard. And it requires attentiveness and a lot of patience because, I would say as a young woman, working with some, I won't say the backgrounds, but with certain, so for example, there was a situation where the government is providing support, and yet because they're unable to manage that money, they might come and ask you for more money, right? And they might, in my situation, because I was an Arab and that person was an Arab, he felt comfortable to ask me for more money outside of work. And of course, that's not permissible. So you will be put in situations where you have to also put your foot down. It's like, no, this is not allowed. Obviously talk politely and everything. And that will just come with training. So these were my first two experiences. After that, I went for my MA. My first MA, it was more historical research based, so I didn't really deal with a lot of vulnerable people. And then my second MA was in Turkey, and that's when I thought I really want to shift to social anthropology. My first MA was in globalization. So it was really studying international trends, global culture, and how it's really influencing everyone everywhere and all of that. My second MA is anthropology. And the reason I chose anthropology is because I think it's a very bottom-up approach, like social work and NGO work, where you have to interview and deal directly with the people to know how they really feel and how their culture impacts them and how their religion impacts them and their life situation shapes who they are. So in Turkey, I was introduced to Uyghurs. Mm-hmm. Those, if you know of the Uyghur crisis in Xinjiang in China, a lot of them have escaped to Turkey. and in many ways escaped indirectly, because a lot of the people I met, at least my generation, were students who were studying in Egypt or Syria or Jordan or other countries. And when the crisis happened, some of the countries were trying to return them back to China. So what they did is they escaped to Turkey before they would be returned back to China. A lot of these people are facing similar trends of refugee crises, although they are not categorized as refugees because they immigrated with money on their own will, without a direct war happening. So this is another situation where you have to really redefine what is vulnerability, because it doesn't really fit in that category, but it does. Anyways, so in this case, they do have similar patterns of trauma, of guilt, of shame. And what I mean by guilt and shame is a lot of these students don't know if their parents are even living or not. So they feel guilty that their parents could have been arrested because of them wanting to study Islamic studies in Al-Azhar in Cairo, for example. So they feel like they're the cause that their parents were arrested. They feel shame that they were not able to protect their families or go back to them. And a lot of them, you would be surprised. I know those who are followers of the Abrahamic religions in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, suicide is not an option. But you would be surprised that a lot of them did contemplate suicide, and some of them attempted suicide even. So we have to really have an open mind when we deal with these issues. So when I was interviewing my interviews were mainly with women. And fortunately, they were English, they knew English, so we were able to communicate in English. That's a whole other kind of vulnerability that I did not experience with Syrian refugees or new immigrants and indigenous people, because for these people, this was a question of it was a political question of land. It was a bit similar with indigenous people, but that one was fresh. I think it's also similar with the Palestinian crisis, but in a sense that they don't feel like they have a country even to. They consider themselves ethnically different from a Han Chinese, definitely, but they were never in modern geography having a land of their own. So they always felt like they're all over the place technically. So with this new crisis of concentration camps for them, it was like, okay, where do we go? Like there's no place that's taking us. And I didn't have experience with Palestinians right away, but I think a lot of Palestinians do feel the same. But that was my first experience with people who are indigenous to a land and don't feel like they can ever go back to it because they don't have even a passport. Like that's it. Like their passports were Chinese, but if now that they're wanted, they can't go to the Chinese embassy to renew it. And they don't have a citizenship anywhere. And if they're in Turkey for a temporary time, their residence permit can expire. And then where do you go, right? Like no passport, no identification, which means you can't get all kinds of services. So you're stuck. You're like, and unfortunately in international politics, even from my political science background, these are people who are just left in the cracks of the system. Like, that the international system also doesn't have an exact support system for these kind of identities. So it was really, for me, a really eye-opening experience, because you feel like there's not much you can do to help them. But yet, they have an incredible amount of resilience because they gather together as a community and they really support each other, and they start to come to accept that, okay, depression, suicide, trauma are symptoms in our current generation. We need to focus on that. And fortunately, these women that I was talking to were educated. So they're really pushing through education to try to provide solutions. But then you will come with the challenge with the older generation that maybe didn't receive the same amount of education, and maybe the traumas are deeper. And sometimes you'll start, as you work in social work, you will notice that the newer generation is maybe trying to do something that the older generation is stopping them from it, that they are too ashamed of even moving anything forward. So, and now I would say there were also other vulnerable people that I dealt with, of illegal immigrants in Turkey from African backgrounds. I didn't deal exactly too much with them, but I have volunteered a few times to work with some of them. And also I visited some places in Istanbul that has a lot of a transgender and transsexual population. And that's a whole other LGBTQ issue that is an issue everywhere. But in the way Istanbul deals with the situations, these people are living in ghettos, and they're very visible in these ghettos. Like you walk and you see them and they're there. So it's hard not to notice them. Nobody really, like in these, because it was around the touristic area, so nobody really bothered with them. But I know it's a big issue in Istanbul, and I know that's a whole other vulnerable community I didn't really go into, and I don't know if I'm equipped enough to go into working with them, because that's now rising up there to be considered something that a lot of social workers need to deal with. But in terms of Istanbul, I don't think there are a lot of NGOs that are dealing with this, obviously due to a lot of religious and political circumstances. So that was the latest community that I slightly interacted with, because the illegal migrants were living around that area as well. And some Syrian refugees were living around that area too. And obviously the reason we call them vulnerable people is because when you live in ghettos, they're more likely to face drugs. They're more likely to face abuse, all kinds of abuse, sexual, physical, verbal. They're more likely not to be employed, and they're more likely to be discriminated against. So when you go into this field, you really gotta go with a strong heart. Is you will face a lot of stories, and it humbles you because you really know, you learn a lot of stories of the human condition that you might not have been, raised with or seen in your social status. But it teaches you a lot. But I think those who work in this field also need to mind their own well-being as well, because when you face a lot of these problems continuously, it starts to get to you. And so you need sometimes to put yourself first. So I would say your well-being is very important, and your mental health is very important, because if you want to help someone, you got to help yourself first. So that's my main advice. And if anybody wants to go into that work and really enjoy it, I think you will really enjoy it if your heart is into it. So
yeah.
I don't know exactly what was the question, but that's my experience with like dealing with these different vulnerable communities.
Yeah. So before, I want to remind the audience that we are going to end this conversation very short. I know it's already late night in your place, right? At your place, so I don't want to make it
9:30. It's 9:30 here. It's 9:30 p.m. So
yeah, okay.
I don't mind giving some time if you have time for any like last one or two questions.
So I mean, if the audience still have question and haven't had an opportunity to ask the question, so ask question very soon because we're gonna end it soon. And Salma, I want to ask you that you work with vulnerable people, right? So is it somehow influenced or impacted to your like mental health? Or if I were you, I imagine if I were you and I witnessing all of that impact of broken system to refugees, for instance, I kind of feel hopeless, where I cannot help them, I cannot do many things for them. At least I feel hopeless. Do you think that you have that kind of impact after dealing with many vulnerable peoples?
I started off that way at the beginning. When you see a lot of when you see this on a daily basis, you start actually becoming numb to it. Like you don't feel it anymore. It doesn't shock you anymore. And I think that's the case a lot of social workers and a lot of researchers in social sciences who work with these kind of demographics face. I needed time off eventually. I think that's why I took my first MA. I didn't really deal with vulnerable people anymore around that time because I felt too overwhelmed. So it definitely does affect you, I would say, for sure, at the beginning, because in most cases we go into it really wanting to help, but you don't realize how heavy it is and how hard it is, because you're dealing with people's hearts and people's lives that is sometimes even the system doesn't have a solution. However, over the time, as I started learning more and interacting more and having mentors in my job, either from my professors, or I had an incredible supervisor when I was working in the NGO. I learned that I really need to balance my life first and know how to develop my emotional intelligence skills and know how to create boundaries. Boundaries are very important when you're dealing with these people. Sometimes they take too much of our time and energy to the point that they can even enter our homes and affect our moods. And this is inevitable. You can't stop that. But you can limit it and you can control it when you learn how to create boundaries. And so eventually, when I went to Turkey and I was introduced to the Uyghur community and I did one of my researches in my MA on it, I started to think of it differently. I started to think that at least for some reason, the Creator has put me in this position and introduced me to these people directly. And my very first interviews were so hard. I was crying. I didn't cry in front of them. I cried alone, but it felt so heavy on me. But then I started realizing that through my first interview with one of the girls, she was contemplating suicide, and she did attempt suicide before. And so in my interview with her, I introduced her to therapy and a specific kind of holistic therapy. And I really encouraged her to consider it. She was not considering it before, and many of them will not. Many of them will think that it's useless. And then, lo and behold, a year later, she originally went into university wanting to study Islamic studies. Now she switched to psychology. And she said that through therapy, she was able to really, through our conversation and me checking on her frequently, she felt that she could be able to help other women and other men who are in her position. That for some reason she went through all of this to do something, that something will come out of it. So that also helped me shift my view that when I interact with these people, your conversations with them, you never know what you will say that will be that little beacon of hope for them. Maybe something, a small gesture, because not a lot of people know their stories and they're not going to go tell it to everyone. You could be having a role, you do play a role, but without even knowing that you're maybe guiding them or helping them in a way that would improve slightly their circumstances. And you would, so So you take in the problems. You have to take it. You have to take them in anyways. But I mean, when you take them in, know that you are there in that position for a reason. You might not fix everything, and you will not be able to fix everything. But through these even little conversations, and even your attempts to try to bring them a job or attempt to better their living circumstances, that does help them a little. Even sometimes you will work with people who will not appreciate it. I'll tell you that. So don't always go expecting that they will appreciate what you do. You go in for your own intentions. However, you go in knowing that even the little thing that you do means a lot and does change circumstances within your means. We work within our means. So when I was giving a talk before on the Uyghur crisis in our community here, usually Muslims like to come out and say, oh my God, always wars happening in our region. Oh my God, we're always discriminated against and whatnot. This is hopeless and nothing is going to get better and all of that. No, there are efforts that everyone are doing within their means, and you need to acknowledge that. So don't lose hope. My advice is always never lose hope. You're doing a great job. Like Lulu, for example, you're doing a great job with this show for these students and everyone to learn from everybody. With the NGO, those who work in the NGO, you're supporting people who can't have an education. Even if, sometimes you'll face problems in the system, and even if you face challenges, your attempt and your choice to work in an NGO that helps these people means something. Rather than just, giving money, which is something we easily do. So just say, a charity, which is nice and amazing and needed, but that's the easy way. The harder way is when you really work through it. So yes, it will get to you. Yes, your mental health will be affected, and sometimes you need breaks. So don't shy away from taking a break. Focus on yourself, get better so that you can be stronger to be able to really, do these little changes that might be very helpful. But don't lose hope. I don't ever feel like there's a quote in Anne of Grey and Gables, which is a Canadian story, that always say to despair is to I forgot it. Never mind. Forget that. I forgot about it. But mainly, despair and losing hope means that we'll never be able to change anything. So it's okay to feel down. It's okay to be sad and cry about the situation. But, always come back saying, okay, there is something little that I can do to make it better. And not a lot of people have this opportunity. A lot of people work in fields that don't have the opportunity to feel that the change that they're doing is really affecting someone. So, if someone works in IT, and I think this is a problem, like I speak as my dad works in IT. He fixes systems and all of that, but he always feels like he's not really touching people's hearts because he's working behind a computer. So if you're someone who's working while you're able to really feel the problem and see a progress or really touch someone throughout the day, this is I think we're very fortunate if we can do that. So
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we encourage each other.
Yes, yeah. Social relations, and I think we're really feeling it with COVID right now, where everyone is distant, but if you're working in such fields, you get to interact with more people, so that's a blessing.
So I think even it is just a small thing that we can do for others, it will create changes. So we doesn't have to be the God that provides everything and solve everything. At least we do something, our best, and it might help others to be better or to the society to be better. Just don't lose. Although sometimes I myself feel like, sometimes I feel like internalizing problems on the student that maybe counsel their problem to me, and although they just like what you say, although they not entering my house, but the vibe, the mood, and everything that happen during the counseling session, I bring it at home. So yeah, it's continuously, the impact continue.
Absolutely. Yep, and that needs a lot of practice to be able to. I'm not saying I'm able to do it. To this day, it's really hard to be able to, say nope. Whatever I heard from this person is not going to ruin my day. it's really hard. It's very hard. So that's why I say it's okay. It's okay to feel despair and hopeless sometimes, but never completely feel like whatever you're doing is not making things better. And I think what could help also is if you can actually like journal down the accomplishments that you made with those, with your clients or in your organization or the NGO you're working with. These like, it's good to go back to and feel like, oh, okay, we've really done something here, because sometimes they can be very slow. Yeah.
Sometimes changes take time, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, okay, Salma, thank you so much for your time and your.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you, Salma.
No, thank you guys, and to the little baby. And I really hope for your students that this is something that is helpful to them in any way. I really hope that. And if anybody has any more questions that I can help with, please feel free to share my contact info. I really don't mind. I wish you guys all the best.
We're gonna take a picture as usual at the end of the session.
We will do that.
Everyone, could you please turn on your video? We're gonna take a picture together. Thank you, Tommy. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. And we are going to have another session with Heather, so please feel free to join. Okay, thank you, Tommy. Thank you, Imas. Thank you, Putri, Lydia, and of course, thank you, Salma. And see you, everyone, next week. Bye-bye.